I'm Liz Sauer from the podcast Ghosts in the Burbs, and I hope you've got your nightlights handy because you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
'Twas the night before Christmas, and deep in the house, a creature was stirring, ready to pounce. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, whilst phantom footsteps ascended the stair. The children were nestled, all snug in their beds, but a dark shadow figure loomed over their heads. And Mama in her kerchief, and I in my cap, were about to be woken by one ghostly rap.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. Welcome one and all to our downright tinselly Christmas episode. The KOFY Christmas tree is up, the studio is ablaze with fairy lights, and with our Christmas jumpers and party hats well and truly donned, we're excited for you to join us in our favourite Christmas tradition of them all, telling ghost stories. What have we got coming up on today's episode, Fitz?
Today we have some seasonal pings of the paranormal radar. We've got lots of fantastic stories from our listeners. We have the annual, slightly dodgy Christmas quiz.
Of course.
And a creepy Christmas legend from a haunted cemetery.
But first, we'd like to thank the wonderful Liz Sauer from Ghosts in the Burbs podcast for introducing our show today. If you haven't yet checked out Ghosts in the Burbs, and you enjoy being chilled to the bone by deliciously creepy tales, you really should give it a listen. It's one of my absolute favourites. So go and give yourself the gift of goosebumps this holiday season. Head on over to ghostintheburbs.com, or you can find Ghosts in the Burbs on iTunes, Podbean and Stitcher. You won't be disappointed, I promise.
It is in fact so spooky that I once very nearly gave Lil a heart attack while she was listening.
You did. I leapt out of bed and hit the ceiling.
Now it's time to uphold the cheesy Christmas tradition of the Knock Once for Yes Christmas quiz.
Oh yes, we're getting straight into it this year. So I'm going to go first. And my question to you is, how many different locations does the ghost of Anne Boleyn reputedly haunt?
I shall ponder that while I tell you about our first paranormal radar story.
You ruminate on that.
Now, this story is a rather seasonal tale from Surrey. On the night of the 11th of December 2002, the Surrey Police switchboard started to light up with calls from concerned motorists. Members of the public had reported seeing a car with headlights blazing suddenly lose control and veer off into a ditch on a stretch of the A3 near Guildford in Surrey. When the police arrived on the scene, they could find no sign of any accident. There were no tyre marks, no debris. The tall undergrowth of the ditch seemed completely undisturbed. Undeterred, they continued to search on foot, and what they discovered was chilling. Hidden deep in the ditch and completely obscured by the rampant vegetation was a maroon Vauxhall Astra. Nose down, windshield shattered and driver's side door badly damaged, but it wasn't a recent accident, and the body they found lying next to the car wasn't a recent death. After identifying the victim, the police came to believe that the fatal accident must have happened in July of that year, 5 months earlier. The victim's brother had made a missing persons report at the time, but the police hadn't had any idea where to look. Some people believe that what the witnesses saw on that December night was a replay of the events leading to the victim's death, and that maybe he simply wanted his fate to be discovered.
So this is just such a fascinating story. I mean, you've got multiple witnesses for one thing, but those witnesses were so convinced of what they'd seen, they all rang the police. to get them to come out and search immediately.
Yeah, I love this story. There's a couple of reasons. One, like you say, it was important enough that people thought that they needed to report it to somebody. And you hear that quite often with incidents of, phantom hitchhikers or people that think they've hit someone in the road.
Yes.
But I don't think I've ever heard of one where they've seen the accident. You often see, like, the sort of apparition of the person that was injured in the accident, trying to get home afterwards. It's always that they get in the back of the car and disappear before they get there, sort of thing. But this one is like the sort of replay of how they got there, and I don't think I've heard of that one before. It's fascinating.
No, I've never heard of anything like this before, and I just wonder whether it was almost perpetrated to give the family some closure, because obviously the victim was missing for 5 months, and that must have been awful. I mean, not that it's any less awful to find the car in the ditch, but at least then they have some answers. Yeah,
some closure. You know what happened to them, and you're not constantly thinking, is he in Costa del Sol, or is he in prison, or...
Exactly, you just don't know, do you? And I don't think it's ever happened again, has it?
I've not heard of anything. If anybody else has heard of something similar, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, but I mean, this isn't an anniversary ghost. You hear about anniversary ghosts where it replays the event year on year on year.
Yeah, and it's 5-6 months after the initial incident.
Yeah, and then that was it.
Like, it just needed to only do it the once, just to say I'm here, and
exactly,
to be found at the right time.
It's a really, really fascinating story, that one. It properly gives you the chills. But have you thought about the quiz question?
I've thought.
Do you know the answer?
No.
Have you got any ideas?
I'm thinking back to the other times we've had a ghost that's been seen at multiple locations.
Yeah.
And at those instances, it's generally only been 2 or 3, I think. So I'm going to give 4.
Oh, you could not be more wrong. It's a lot. 8 that I could find.
Crikey, she gets around, doesn't she?
I know, she must be exhausted. We've got Hever Castle, which is where she grew up. Windsor Castle, where she's seen as a screaming headless figure running down a corridor.
How can a headless figure scream?
Her head is screaming, tucked under her arm.
I was going to say, it's not just a sort of body without a head. She's carrying
She's carrying her screaming head.
Oh, crikey, okay.
I know. At Blickling Hall in Norfolk, where she's not only headless, but arrives in a horse-drawn coach driven by a headless horseman.
This is beginning to sound to me a little bit like, I can do better than that.
I know, it's just one-upmanship. Sal Church, which is also in Norfolk, supposedly due to a legend that her body was removed from the Tower of London and reburied at Sal Church beneath a black, plain marble tombstone. She's also been seen strolling the grounds of Yew Tree Walk at Marwell Hall, where her husband Henry VIII betrayed her and planned his wedding to Jane Seymour.
Now, if there's any time you want to run around headless screaming, it's there.
It's that, yeah. Hampton Court, where she's only sometimes headless. Rochford Hall in Essex, supposed site of clandestine meetings between herself and Henry. And, of course, she's been seen at the Tower of London, where she was held and executed. Sometimes as a white lady in the courtyard where she was kept prisoner, or walking down the aisle of the church towards her grave. And once, a captain of the guard saw her apparition leading a whole ghostly entourage of ladies and knights parading through the chapel.
I guess I failed this round.
You lose.
How do we go about scoring this? Is it just 1 for each one we get right? Or if we give 1 and the other person doesn't get it, do we get a point as well?
I think I'm going to wait and see how hard your questions are before I decide how we score it. What's your quiz question to me before we go to the next Paranormal Radar story?
Okay, my very first question. I think it's fairly easy. But
you said that last time.
We all know that Santa is rather fond of a glass of warm milk and a biscuit, or cookie for our American cousins. But do you know what's customary to be left out as an offering to Krampus?
A child? No. I will think on it. I will think on it while I tell you the very Christmassy tale of Cape Girardeau in Missouri. The Glen House in Cape Girardeau is an opulent historic home built in 1883 by prominent builder Edwin Dean, who gave the house as a wedding gift to his daughter Lula. The house has been faithfully restored with many of the original architectural features and fittings and filled with authentic period furniture, but it's no longer lived in and is now a museum owned by the Historical Association of Greater Cape Girardeau and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And, of course, it's haunted. But the resident ghosts seem to have a particular love of Christmas. Every year, the volunteers dress the house lavishly to evoke the feel of a prosperous 1900s house in the full swing of festive cheer, ready for the special Christmas events and tours they hold. But it seems the act of decking the halls stirs the ghostly activity to life. Decorations are mysteriously moved, presents are found stacked up or even opened, and one volunteer reported running into an inexplicably icy cold spot on the stairs. And yet more ghostly occurrences have been experienced when the volunteers are clearing up at the end of the holiday season. One January, the same volunteer who experienced the cold spot was taking down the last Christmas decorations in the kitchen with the help of a local florist when they both heard clear footsteps overhead, walking from the master bedroom across the hallway and into the nursery. The two women stared at each other, knowing full well that they had just checked and locked the rest of the house, and that it was empty. Unsurprisingly, they decided it was time to leave, and the volunteer wasn't keen to go back into the house alone after this incident. When questioned over her hesitation, a board member did some research into the house and told her they'd discovered that a young girl fell to her death on the stairs and was found in the exact place the cold spot had manifested.
Ooh, creepy Christmas story.
I know.
Is it like an anniversary ghost? Did the little girl die at Christmas? Is it just that, or?
It didn't say when the little girl died, so there's not an obvious tie-in to the fact that it all kicks off around Christmas time. But I wondered, because it was so obvious they make a big deal of Christmas, just looking at the tourist information and things like that. They have all sorts of events and the house sort of burst to life. I mean, normally it's a museum. I don't know how much foot traffic they have, but it looks like there's a lot more activity during this time of year. And I wonder if it's just that, especially if a ghost is haunting there because they used to live there and perhaps it's quite quiet and all of a sudden there's all this activity going on. Maybe it's just that.
Yeah, it is kind of what I associate with Christmas, is rushing around and seeing lots of people that you don't see very often, and
generally being
randomly
hectic.
dropping by. Yeah, just all that sort of noise and activity.
Yeah, exactly. I just wonder whether it's literally the festivities themselves.
So, offerings to Krampus, what do you reckon?
I don't know. Is it some sort of dead animal?
No.
I mean, it's quite a grim legend. I was assuming that the offering would be kind of grim as well.
No, the offering itself isn't too bad. He's a bit of a, he likes a tipple, does Krampus. It's rather traditional to leave him a glass of schnapps.
Ah, okay. I can get down with that. Fair enough.
Fair exchange.
Yep.
Schnapps. I think a lot of parents would probably go, actually, we'll keep the schnapps.
Oh, that's a bit harsh.
Just in case anyone's worried, I was joking.
Well, that makes us even at the moment. So, you ready for my next question?
Yep, bring it on.
Okay. August of this year saw a paranormal bidding war on eBay when a supposedly haunted doll was listed, sparking an international bidding frenzy. Or at least that's how the media reported it. I can't speak to how much actual frenzy occurred, but my question to you is, how much did the haunted doll eventually sell for?
I don't know. My first thought is, why would you pay for one?
Well, yeah, that was forefront of my mind as well.
I would have thought it would be more a case of, I will pay you if you will remove from me this haunted doll.
You'd have thought, wouldn't you?
I'm guessing that's not the case.
No, not at all.
I shall have a think while we hear our very first story.
Yes, and this is from May, who sent us a Christmas Eve story. In June of 2008, I graduated from nursing school. I'd been a CNA before I became an RN, so a hospital environment was not new to me at all. This story takes place on Christmas Eve, 2008. Being one of the newer nurses, I was scheduled to work the night shift of Christmas Eve. I was sent to a different floor to cover it. I normally worked on a surgical floor, and this, the third floor of the hospital, was just an overflow unit. To give a little bit of background on the hospital, the original wooden building was built in 1890 by the Catholic Church for a group of nuns. In 1902, the wooden building burnt down, and by 1906 it had been rebuilt, but this time in stone. Over the years it had been added onto, with the newest section being built in the 1980s. The section of the hospital that I was working in that night was built in the 50s. There was a very long hallway that ran from north to south, and then hallways that abutted this central corridor, running east to west. I was assigned in that unit with another nurse named Lee. At midnight, Lee said she wanted to go take lunch. I said sure, not a problem. The way that this unit sat was facing west, and there was a nurse's station right next to the main hallway, patient rooms along both sides, and at the end was a break room on the right-hand side, and an alarmed stairwell across from that. A few minutes after Lee departed for lunch, I saw a black figure move very fast down the hallway towards the break room. It stood tall and had the shape of a person. I got up and looked to see if I could see anyone. I checked all the patients' rooms, but I found no one. I didn't check the break room, but frankly, there's no way it could have been my co-worker. I saw her walk down there and I heard the door close. Her hour went by, and I was still at the nurse's station as it was a very slow night. She came up to me and said, "Can I ask you a question?" "Sure," I said. "Did you just walk down the hallway?" "Nope, I sure didn't," was my reply. She walked into the med room behind me. Suddenly, she came back out and said, "Are you sure? I was in my patient's room checking on him on my way back from break, and as I was standing in the doorway, I saw someone walk by, but when I went to look for them, there was no one there." She said all of this unprompted and before I'd filled her in on what I had seen. So then I told her what had happened. She said, "We're sticking together tonight." It never felt malicious or bothered me again after that. It was just a weird experience in a hospital full of weird experiences.
Wow, what a great story. Thank you, May, for sending that in to us.
Nothing more festive than a shadow figure.
One would argue perhaps that reindeer, maybe snowmen, are slightly more festive than shadow people.
Not in my mind. I do think it's really interesting, though, that they both independently saw the same thing and neither knew at that time what the other one had seen.
Yeah, it's those stories that I really live for. There's so many times where you see something and there's always that thing where it could have been.
There's always that shadow of doubt.
Yeah, it could have been something out of the corner of your eye. Could have been any one of a number of things. But when you see something and the person that's with you goes, "Did you just see what I saw?"
And it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, that's when I think, wow, there's definitely something that was there that needs looking into.
That's when the goosebumps break out.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you know the answer?
I don't. I'm kind of along this theme where I wouldn't expect people to pay a lot for something like that. But then I suppose you've got people out there like Zach Bagans who would pay lots of money for that sort of thing. But
yeah,
how big is the market?
Interest in it. Well, ballpark figure.
Ballpark figure.
Have a guess.
100 quid?
Oh, no. No, way out. I'm going to tell you. £866.
No.
866 English pounds.
Who's got 850 quid to spend on a
Well, not
haunted
me,
doll?
but certainly not to spend on a haunted doll. I'm afraid I'm just of the opinion that, well, like you, if you're selling it on eBay, you're obviously not that desperate to get rid of it, are you? I mean, if I've got to say, I've actually had some run-ins in the past with suspicious, at least, objects. And my first thought is not to list them on eBay.
No.
It's to get them dealt with.
Get this thing out of my house as soon as you can.
Yep.
I wonder, perhaps, is there a chance that it was, if it's a haunted doll, that's sort of not necessarily true, but it implies that it's older, maybe it's collectible.
That's not why he bought it. He bought it because it was
definitely
haunted.
because it was.
And I think because he wanted to investigate it, which I can see. But, well, apparently, since bringing the doll into his home, the new owner has experienced strange noises, flickering lights, items being broken, and a family member getting scratched.
Oh.
But, I mean, if you spent nearly £1,000 on a haunted doll, I suppose you'd want some kind of activity to happen. Otherwise, you'd be quite disappointed.
Yeah, I'm still not quite following the logic of, I want bad things to happen to me, so I'll spend nearly £1,000 to get that. Okay,
but,
maybe I'm just weird.
Each to his own, and if they want to investigate this, rather them than me. So before we get into our next story, what have you got for me?
Okay, well, I don't think this one's too bad.
But you say that about literally everyone, and I haven't got one right yet.
I think in this one there's two possible answers.
Okay.
One of them's quite hard, and the other one we have every Christmas.
Okay,
so you're familiar with the Yule log?
I am, both chocolate and wooden.
Comes from the sort of Scandinavian Germanic tradition.
Yep.
In said tradition, there are two other Yule items or things.
Okay.
Can you name one of them?
Oh, there's a chance I might be able to dredge this from the depths of my memory. Let me think about it while we listen to this next story, which is from Jason.
My name is Jason Chikeli from Hackensack, New Jersey, USA, and I have a couple of stories to tell about my family and a missing cross. I grew up in a rather large Italian family just outside of New York City. Growing up, I never met my grandfather or any of my mother's aunts and uncles because they had all died before I was born. So their stories were always shared at dinner time or sitting around for coffee and cake after dinner. Sometimes, after those dinners, my sister and I would beg and plead to stay over at Grandma's house so that we could get a little something special from her. You see, she would always give us something special from my grandma and grandpa's collection of jewellery or World War II memorabilia. This time was different. We didn't receive anything this weekend with the exception of her company. A few weeks go by and my mother gets a phone call from my grandmother in a little bit of a panic. I'm looking for a piece of jewellery I seem to have lost. It's a gold cross pendant with lines that are gouged into it. Have you seen it? My mother really had no idea what she was asking about, but she said she would look around the house to see if my sister or myself had taken it from her jewellery box. She asked both of us, but we had no clue as to what she was talking about. She never did find it. As time went on, we thought nothing of it. My grandmother more than likely lost the pendant she was looking for. On Wednesdays, my mother likes to do laundry for the whole house. She calls herself Our Lady of Perpetual Laundry. While switching out the clothes from the washer to the dryer and removing the hanging clothes from the line in the basement, she noticed something shiny on one of the support beams. She walked over to get a closer look. To her surprise, it was the cross pendant hanging on a nail in the dead centre of the support beam. She asked everyone in the house if they put it there, but no one owned up to it. Many years later, I had the chance to find out who really put the cross there. One night in 2004, I was 17 at the time, a couple of friends and myself were looking for something to do. We were at my friend Laura's house where her family had always played board games. She said to us, "Let's play a board game." After looking through her stacks on stacks of board games, we stumbled across a Ouija board. "Let's do it," she said. "My mum can help us. She can get anyone on the board." I didn't want to be a part of it because of past times I'd used a Ouija board and it didn't work out so well. I stayed off it while my other two friends and her mum worked on finding someone to talk to. After a few tries, they finally found someone. "Are you a woman?" "No." "Are you a man?" "Yes." "Do you know anyone on the board?" "No." "Do you know anyone off the board?" "Yes." Now, I'm getting a little nervous. The chills and hair standing up kind of nervous. The only nervousness you can associate with a horror movie. My heart dropped. "Ask him something that none of us would know," they said to me. Thinking to myself, I only knew one thing to ask. Something that no one would be able to answer. Something I never told anyone other than my family. Was it my grandfather who put the cross in the basement? No. Spell out who it was then. Once I asked that, the needle pointed to 6 letters. M-I-L-L-I-E. Millie. My grandfather's sister. No one knew who she was on the board. Once I found out it was her, I went home and told my mother. With a smile and a roll of her eyes, she said, "Of course it was her, I should have known." To this day, the cross still hangs on the beam in my basement back home. I'm living in San Francisco now, and I still get chills when I share this story.
Oh, thank you, Jason, for that amazingly creepy story. But you know what? This is the second time very recently I've heard a story from somebody that's chosen not to partake in a Ouija board session, but the spirit that's come through has been addressing that person specifically outside the circle with information that only they would know.
Oh, that's really weird.
It is, because when you think about the ideomotor movement and the potential explanations for Ouija boards, and they all make perfect sense. But how does something like that happen? How do you get somebody outside that environment that's not physically taking part and then to come up with this information that only they know?
Yeah, it's definitely weird. And I love the way that the mother reacted to it as well.
I know.
When he mentioned it, it's like, of course it was. I don't know what I was thinking.
Why didn't I think of that? What a brilliant reaction. That's fantastic.
Thank you, Jason. Really loved that one.
Did.
So, Yule things.
Right. I'm going to be so gutted if I get this wrong. I should know this. Is it mistletoe?
No.
Oh, no, you're kidding.
No, that one I think is sort of Celtic, Druidic.
Oh, yeah, you could be right,
Germanic.
Actually. Yeah. No, I don't know them. Tell me.
Well, there's 2 answers. One of them I'd seen pictures, but I hadn't really sort of known the background, which is a Yule goat.
I think I have seen, same as you, don't really know much about it.
Don't really know much about it.
Okay.
Apparently there's a popular theory that Thor was drawn across the sky in his chariot by 2 goats.
Okay.
Named, I apologise in advance to anyone from Scandinavia who is going to want to kill me for my terrible pronunciation, but I believe they're called Tanngrusner and Tannoster.
Good try.
Yeah, I gave it a try. Sorry. And this may also come from a Proto-Slavic festival which honours the god of a fertile harvest called Devak, who was often represented as a white goat.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
So you've got one left. I'll give you a final chance. We have it at Christmas dinner or something similar to it.
Or something similar to it?
Yeah.
What do we have at Christmas dinner? Goose?
Actually, no, I'll revise that. Boxing Day dinner.
Ham? Pigs? Something to do with pigs?
Yule boar.
Yule boar!
Yes.
Oh, that's a fantastic idea. I think from now on, every Christmas, we should have a hog roast instead of a turkey.
It is a customary Yule sacrifice, and the tradition is continued today with the Christmas ham.
I did not know that. That's so cool.
There you go.
Yeah, totally. Can we have a hog roast instead of a turkey?
Are you going to tell your mother that she's not
Cooking-
to bother with the
cooking a
Anson
hog
bit of
roast?
ham and that she ought to do a hog roast instead?
Yeah, you're right. That probably wouldn't go down too well.
I'm not sure if I'm classing that as a winner. I think you got that one. So
Well,
you're in
with
the
a
lead.
lot of help, I think that maybe half a point for that one. just a half point.
You're not going to go easy on me now, though, are you?
No.
Oh.
Okay, so this is my last quiz question to you. You might know it. I don't know. In which famously haunted location did a group of ghost hunters unwittingly uncover an ancient grave?
That's a bit vague.
Well, you did say I wasn't going to go easy on you now.
You certainly did not go easy on me with that one.
Nope.
And nothing's springing to mind, but I shall think on it as we discuss our Christmas-themed paranormal postcard.
Yes, and this is actually one of the first creepy places we went together. And we hadn't been together long, and Fitz just said randomly one day, "Oh, you've got to come to this abandoned cemetery I found." And I knew it was meant to be.
Yeah, I took Lil on the best dates.
You certainly did. And this particular haunted cemetery has a creepy Christmas ghost story. About a mile east of the village of Boughton in Northamptonshire is the crumbling, derelict church of St John the Baptist. Built in 1350 on the sacred spring of St John the Baptist, it's been dilapidated since at least 1757 and suffered further damage when the spire collapsed in 1784. These ruins are the last remaining evidence of medieval Boughton. These days it's pretty well maintained, but when we first visited some years ago it was quite overgrown, the church ruins all but hidden under heavy trusses of climbing ivy, with the weathered gravestones peeking out from between swathes of nettles and brambles. It seemed a place out of time, and every inch a place of mystery and ghosts. There was a sinister shadow cast over the church even when it was still in use during the reign of Richard III, when the parishioners were subjected to a rather gruesome sight. Rabbits invaded the church grounds from a nearby warren and dug up the graveyard, bringing the bones of the long deceased up to the surface for all to see.
When you talk about rabbits invading, I've just got this image of armoured rabbits, like in formation. It's like grave digging party.
Shield wall! A description found amongst deeds in a local church chest reads, "The bones dug up by the conies would fill a scuttle, and a man can go scantly in a corner of it, but he shall find it full of dead men's bones, a thing most piteous to be seen." Then, in 1826, Boughton became famous for being the place where the notorious highwayman Captain Slash was detained before being tried and hung for his crimes.
When Lil first told me about this, I really didn't think I thought she was pulling my leg, basically.
No,
Captain Slash.
He's honestly called Captain Slash.
And then my second thought was of Captain Flashheart from Blackadder.
Oh yeah, I kept thinking of that as well. But do you know what his real name was?
Come on, bring it on.
George.
Okay, I can see if you've got a name. I'm George the Highwayman.
It doesn't work, does it? No.
Yeah.
Well, the rather fabulously named Captain Slash, aka George, and his gang of thieves thought they'd try the luck at the busy and popular Boughton Fair. On the last night of the fair, they scattered themselves among the booths and started attacking the stallholders, forcing them to hand over their money. The highwayman's ultimate plan, it seems, was to release the animals from a visiting menagerie and take advantage of the ensuing chaos to do some looting. But their plans were thwarted when locals managed to round them up and they were arrested. During the struggle, Captain Slash ended up with a fractured skull that is said to have behaved with the greatest hardihood.
I'm not entirely sure what the greatest hardihood means.
Well, I shall tell you. An account of his trial appeared as an interesting historical record published in the Northampton Herald in 1882. It reads, "After a prolonged struggle, Catherall," that being George's surname by the way, "and some of his companions were captured and brought to this town, where 7 were subsequently committed for trial. The soi-disant captain had his skull fractured and a finger broken, and when taken, seemed to be almost lifeless. At the police court, he behaved with the greatest hardihood. A bystander remarked, 'He seems to be dead,' to which Catherall, slightly raising himself from the chair in which he lay, replied, 'I'm not dead, and shan't be until I have the rope around my neck.'"
I'm not dead.
I know, all I could think of was that scene from Monty Python. I'm not dead. Captain Slash, or George, stood trial and was accused of robbing a shoemaker of 11 half-crowns, 1 crown, a neckerchief, a corkscrew, and a waistcoat. Even for 1826, that doesn't seem like a lot. But it got him the death penalty, and he was subsequently hanged in Northampton and buried in an unmarked grave.
Incidentally, we used to work in the building that was the old jailhouse.
Yep.
And our new office is only about 100 yards away, and from the office windows you can see where they used to hang the prisoners.
You can, so we're literally overlooking the place where Captain Slash took his last breath. Apparently, just before the drop, he kicked off his shoes and let them fall into the crowd. People say that this was one last act of defiance, because his mother had always chided him that he would die with his shoes on. I'll admit I got a bit carried away with the history on this one because it's such a juicy story, but back to the ghosts. Of course, his ghost is said to haunt Boughton Green where he was arrested, and the Spinney by the ruins of the nearby St John's the Baptist Church, especially at Christmas time. And the notorious Captain Slash is not the only apparition reported to appear at the derelict church around Christmas time. So whether the two tales have become intertwined over the years, or possibly that there's just something about the place that brings the ghosts out at this time of year, we don't really know. But the next tale is a cautionary one, warning villagers of the dangers of passing the churchyard at night, and especially on Christmas Eve. The legend tells of a young couple who married at the church in the 18th century, but mere hours after the wedding, the groom dropped dead, and his heartbroken bride, unable to cope with the loss, sadly took her own life at his graveside. Her restless spirit is said to haunt the graveyard on a Christmas Eve night, waiting in the shadows for any unwary passers-by who might be returning home from a festive night of revelry. The apparition is said to be beautiful, blue-eyed with flaming red hair. She beguiles her victims into stealing a kiss, then arranges to meet them again in a month's time. Anyone foolish or unlucky enough to fall victim to her charms apparently does indeed meet her again in one short month, when they inexplicably drop dead. In 1875, William Parker, a young and unmarried local farmer, was celebrating the Yuletide with his friends at a pub in the nearby village of Moulton on Christmas Eve. Full of festive cheer and not a little bit tipsy, the local legend and its dire warnings were far from his mind as he began to wend his way home, passing as he did so the shadowy churchyard of St John the Baptist. As he came upon the entrance, he saw a slender young woman with blue eyes and long red hair appear out of the darkness. She was beautiful and charming, and with the festive cheer of the pub still warming him, he soon found himself kissing her strangely cold lips and making promises to meet again in a month's time. Only as she was walking away did the realization take him in an icy grip as her footsteps made no sound. The next morning, he told his tale to the other villagers, and with a collective horror, they waited to see if the legend would prove true. Sure enough, 1 month later, the phantom bride claimed another victim, and William Parker was dead. In another version of this local lore, it's said that the dead bride and her groom both haunt the church, and you could be approached by either apparition on a Christmas Eve night, depending on whether you're a man or a woman, so ladies, do not think you're safe. But it seems that there's been a very long tradition of one ghost or another appearing at the church on Christmas Eve. In fact, there was an account from the 1700s published in a local magazine in December of 1908. It was titled A Christmas Story 1708, and it starts very ominously indeed. Now I, John Wakefield, have thought it proper to set down these things that follow, for a lesson to those that come after, and for a serious warning. The narrator seems to have been a churchwarden for the nearby village church of Kingsthorpe. He died in 1718, and talks of how it hath for some time past been the habit of this parish to give credit to an idle tale, that on the eve of Christmas a ghost may be seen on the old churchyard of Buckton Green.
Hang on a minute, I thought we were talking about Boughton.
Yes, this is going to get slightly confusing because this whole thing is written in ye olde English with all the E's and everything, and story is with an IE at the end. Place names change over history, and Boughton itself, when I looked online, there was about 6 different versions of Boughton, one of which was Buckton, spelt with a CK, and that's how Boughton is referred to all the way through this, so it is Boughton Green, but he's calling it Buckton.
Fair enough.
Now, the narrator and some characters in the story do seem to have been actual local figures, but just how factual the account is hard to say. But I'm going to tell it anyway, because if it's true, what we have here is a paranormal blooper from 1708.
Oh, awesome.
I know, and it actually starts on a dark and stormy night. I'm not even kidding. It begins. Shortly before last Yuletide, there was gathered together one dark and stormy night at the hostelry of the White Hart, a profane and unhallowed company, the chief of whom was Jonas White, a weaver of this parish of Kingsthorpe. The subject of their unrighteous discourse was concerning the strange apparition said to appear on the eve of Yuletide amidst the graves of Buckton churchyard. The more sober of the party essayed to moderate the heat of the arguments, but Jonas White, being full of the potent liquor, continually asserted he was afraid of neither mortal nor ghost. Upon this, Robert Bledsoe offered to wager his 3-year-old steer against the 2 pigs of Jonas White, that the weaver dared not, upon the eve of Yuletide, at the hour of midnight, wend his way through the churchyard of the aforementioned Buckton Green. The drunken weaver not only accepted the wager, but, being puffed up with conceit of himself, affirmed that he would also take a hank of yarn from his store and wind it in and out amongst the graves of the churchyard.
So was this like the labyrinth with the Minotaur and he was worried about getting lost, or was it just that he wanted to prove that he was going to do it?
I think it was just proof that he'd been there, maybe, or perhaps it would just stop him sort of flying straight through as fast as he could. I'm not sure what the war was about. But anyway, with the wager set, the gathering agreed to meet again at the White Hart on Christmas Eve, before setting off for the haunted churchyard. However, also in the pub that night was one David Shelby from the nearby village of Malton. Overhearing the conversation between the locals of Kingsthorpe, he decided to play a mighty prank on them all. He set off home for Malton, determined to find a volunteer to play the ghost.
I have an image of my head of like the sort of cartoon villain and the camera zooming in to somebody in a dark corner as arching an eyebrow. Dun, dun, dun.
It's brilliant, isn't it? Meanwhile, the plot thickens. Meanwhile, Robert Bledsoe, the instigator of the wager, was hatching his own plans, possibly with his own arched eyebrow. He had a dastardly motive behind the bet, in that he had a greedy eye on the weaver's 3 fat pigs. His plan all along had been to dress up as the ghost himself, jump out at Jonas, and scare him into losing the bet and his prize animals. Christmas Eve came, and the impious band of miscreants, as the author describes them, gathered in the hostelry of the White Hart and set off for the churchyard. When the church bells of neighbouring Malton rang out at midnight, an ashen-faced Jonas started down the path with his ball of yarn. Unbeknownst to him, on the northern side of the churchyard, the men of Malton had placed their ghost, or rather the only willing volunteer they could find, who happened to be a drunken highwayman who they'd plastered with honey and then covered in soot. I don't know why, presumably to make him dark and shadowy. I'm not sure what the honey and soot was about, but that's what they did. Before setting the bewildered fellow stumbling through the shadowy graves like a shambling apparition.
I'm no wonder they only found the drunken highwayman. It's like approaching people in the pub. You know, you want to do what?
Do you want to play a ghost?
You want to cover me in? No.
No, how about no? Meanwhile, Robert Bledsoe, all dressed up in white, snuck away from the Kingsthorpe men to the eastern side of the churchyard, hoping to cut across Jonas's path and deliver his phantom fright. Of course, you can imagine what happened. They all 3 met in the middle, none of them knowing anything about the other's wicked plots, and they all believed they were encountering the real ghost and fled in terror. But also, seeing these wraith-like figures darting through the graveyard, the assembled villagers believed that they were witnessing a manifestation of the legendary ghost, and they too fled in horror. And soon, only the inebriated highwayman was left, and was found the next morning sleeping off his liquor-soaked stupor next to the road. So how did our narrator come to hear this tale, you may ask? And this may just be the best bit. Well, it seems Jonas and Robert eventually figured out what had happened. And then, of course, there was the matter of the wager to settle. According to the narrator, since that time, both have come to me to determine which won the wager. But, being a servant of the Lord, I gave them a discourse upon the sin of gambling, and declared that the pigs and steer forfeit to the church for a thank offering for their deliverance on that eventful night, which should, say, pay the cost of repairs to the western doorway. I just love that. I think that's brilliant. Give them this lecture up on the sin of gambling, but actually he just wanted to pay for some repairs to the church.
And steal their pigs and steer.
Exactly.
As wonderful as these legends are, they are just that, unsubstantiated legends. Although they do make a fantastic story.
That they do.
But there are plenty of ghostly goings-on at Boughton which have been seen by multiple witnesses right up to the present day. The ruined church sits close to a country road that runs between Boughton and Malton, and the sharp bend in this road, just before the cemetery, is the location of other ghostly sightings. Multiple witnesses have driven along this dark, winding road at night, only to be startled by a man running out into the road directly in front of their cars. Slamming on their brakes, they have been convinced of an impending impact, but have looked up to find the road empty and deserted, and no sign of the man at all. One unlucky woman even encountered this apparition twice. The first time she saw the figure, it was crouching in the road as she came upon the bend, but as she braked hard to avoid a collision, it disappeared. The second time she saw him, he darted out across the road and she watched in horror as he vanished into the side of her car. He was clear enough that she could give a fairly detailed description, around 30 years old, in long, dark, over-the-knee leather boots, with grey trousers, a white ruffled shirt and dark hair. She was struck by how he seemed completely oblivious to any vehicles. Other reports include hearing the sounds of children crying and capturing audio recordings of an unknown person repeatedly apologising for something.
Well, that description doesn't sound like modern clothes, does it? Knee-high, over the knee leather boots and a white ruffled shirt. And I've got to wonder whether that road's always been in the same place. Perhaps it ran slightly differently before, because why would you crouch in the middle of the road? It seems a really odd thing to be doing. But the other thing that caught my attention was capturing audio recordings of an unknown person repeatedly apologising for something. That sounds to me like maybe if we can ever get our digital recorder to work again, we could take it out there. Because it's not far.
We certainly wouldn't be the first people to investigate Boughton Cemetery. Those of you that remember episode 10, I believe it was, where I went on my own ghost hunting adventure, I went along with a local team called UKHaunted, and they have been to Boughton Cemetery on multiple occasions and got some rather interesting evidence. I'll put a link in the description to some of their YouTube episodes so you can have a look for yourselves, but on camera they've recorded something from the ghost box saying, "I'm John."
Yeah, and this has happened a few times. Like Fitz said, they've investigated on multiple occasions and they often use the ghost box there. Now, to give a bit of backstory, there's a particular gravestone in the cemetery, and the gravestone is that of a previous owner or landlord, I think, called John. And quite often on the ghost box, they get the name John come through. We've heard it quite a few times, and it often sounds like it's the same voice.
Yeah, it's weird.
Very strange.
I'm not the biggest sort of supporter of ghost boxes and things like that, but it does seem interesting that they repeatedly get the same John or "I'm John" in the same location in the same voice.
And this is the thing that intrigues me. It's mostly been "I'm John," so it's not just the name that's coming through. Like you, I'm not a massive believer in the ghost box, but this did intrigue me because I think it's about 3 times on separate occasions it's come through saying "I'm John," sounding like it's in the same voice. And it is, I think it's in the area where that gravestone is.
Yeah, they were stood right next to it when they called it.
Very strange.
Yeah, as well as that, they've also seen a headless figure. I believe it was one night they were there, they saw a headless figure's shadow walking along the wall.
Yeah.
They've seen somebody dressed in a, what I would call sort of farmer's uniform of flat cap and tweed peering at them over the fence. But as soon as they went up to the wall to look over, there was nobody there and nowhere they could have hidden.
And that was in broad daylight as well.
It was. They've also seen, I think, a child peeking round one of the walls and a lady in white. There's been a lot that they've experienced up there.
I think the lady in white they've actually seen a couple of times, and the children peeking around the gravestones would tie in with the other stories of hearing children there.
Indeed.
But do we know if they've actually investigated there on Christmas Eve?
Yes, they have.
Have they?
Yes,
Oh.
I think that was the first visit they did was on the Christmas Eve.
Well, rather them than me, I'm afraid. Even for the interest of the show, I'm not going to volunteer to spend my Christmas Eve sitting in a cold, dark cemetery. Sorry, guys. Well, I think it's time for you to give me an answer to my last quiz question.
Come on, remind me again what it was.
Okay, in which famously haunted location did a group of ghost hunters unwittingly uncover an ancient grave?
Oh.
And it seems vague, but when I tell you the answer, you're going to slap your forehead and say, "Of course."
So ancient grave, I'm thinking Barrows. I'm thinking either sort of far reaches of Scotland, or I'm thinking Stonehenge.
Nope, neither of those. It is the 12th century ancient Ram Inn at Wootton-under-Edge in Gloucestershire.
Ugh.
Apparently, in June of 1997, paranormal investigators from Swindon were given permission to tear up part of the floor in the men's kitchen. They were hunting for the entrance to a sealed cellar. I think there's lots of legends about tunnels that run under the Ram Inn to the church because it was part of church property, I think, and there are often various tunnels under these kinds of buildings, aren't there? But what they found instead was a grave containing the skeletal remains of a woman and child, buried with broken iron shards. The iron pieces were sent for analysis to Bristol Museum, who conceded that they may be from a ritual iron dagger. But really frustratingly, no matter how much I researched, I couldn't find out if they analysed the bones. Now, maybe it's just me, but I'd want to get the archaeologists in, and I don't know whether it was because it was from 1997, so probably before all this stuff was digitised. I don't know. Perhaps it's just not on the internet, but I couldn't find the age of the bones or anything like that. But it is quite famously well known that this grave is in the ancient Ram Inn. In fact, it's still uncovered. I think there's a cross in it. If you can go and investigate there, and it is still all open for investigators to literally investigate over. People have done spirit box sessions and court EVPs and things like that there. So very interesting. Now, if you're up on your paranormal news, you might already know that wonderfully eccentric owner of the ancient Ram Inn, John Humphreys, sadly passed away recently. He actually saved the building from demolition after falling in love with it in 1968, and he lived there for the rest of his life.
Yes, he certainly followed in the British tradition of being a little bit eccentric.
He seemed like a fantastic character, didn't he?
He really did.
Well, before we go to our next story, have you got another question for me?
I have another question for you.
You've got a glint in your eye. I'm a bit worried.
No, I haven't got any of yours, so you've clearly won, even with your half a point already. So this is just, it's a foregone conclusion, but it is not too hard. Okay, so the Roman festival of Saturnalia is traditionally celebrated between the 17th and 23rd of December, and it had many similarities with our modern Christmas celebrations. Can you think of two forms of celebration that are common to both? One of them was referenced in the last question as well. So.
Okay. I'll think about it. And in the meantime, we'll have our story from Sarah in Columbus, Ohio. I've had quite a few instances of paranormal experiences in my childhood, but nothing as of lately in my adult years. I'd like to share a couple of the events that stand out the most in my life. When I was about 5, my parents divorced, and my mum moved herself and her 3 young children to a run-down old Victorian house that was being slowly flipped by the owner, who went to our church. He really did a favour to my mother and provided rent very cheap for the house in her time of need. My sister and I were always together, since we were closer in age than my teenage brother. My mother, being single and supporting 3 children on her own, worked as a teacher during the day and did accounting for Cedar Point at night. My sister and I, being 6 and 9 years old, used to watch TV in my mother's bed and fall asleep until she would get home, then move to our room that we shared. One evening, we were both watching television in her bedroom, with the lights on, waiting for our mother to return from work. Her room was at the top of the stairs, and the door overlooked the top landing. We heard footsteps coming upstairs and were so excited that our mother was home. We missed her so much with her busy work schedule. We got up out of bed and stood at the doorway of her room and saw that no one was at the stairs at all. The stairway was empty. In this house, my brother would come to my sister and I, angrily accusing us of throwing his speakers and stereo from the top of his dresser across his room. He always kept his door closed because we had 2 cats who very much disliked my brother and would relieve themselves on his dirty gym and football clothes. My sister and I had no knowledge of what had happened to his stereo, but recall seeing it after his accusations, strewn across the room as if someone had flung it from the top of his dresser. My mother had also come to my sister and I in visible concern. She was holding up a bloody washcloth that she'd found hung in the bathroom that my sister, brother and I all shared together, whilst my mother had her own bathroom that she entered from her room. Neither of my siblings or I were hurt and had no idea where the bloody cloth had come from. I still don't know to this day. After we had lived in the Victorian house for a year or two, my mother had saved enough to buy a newer house a few blocks away. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, there was a time that I was incredibly sick. I'd come down with what was probably the flu when we were in Toronto, Canada, to see Phantom of the Opera. I never left the hotel room except to go to Phantom of the Opera, and I fainted during the intermission from being so ill. When we came back from the trip, I was still very sick and not getting better. I was sleeping in my mother's bed, as us kids did when any of us was sick, and woke up to see a hefty, tall man leaning on the doorframe to her room. I couldn't make out any features as her room was dark, and his frame was illuminated by light behind him from the living room. My brother was the only man who lived in the house, and he's 6'3", approximately 180 pounds. Not hefty at all. But I didn't feel scared in the least. I felt calm. I called for my mother and told her there was a man standing in the doorway, but he vanished, almost like a shadow, dissolving in front of me. My mother checked my temperature, and I could tell there was some concern in her voice when she calmly told me I had to get into a bath of cold water. Later on, I talked with my mother about what I saw, and she told me that she had seen him too, but at different times, months earlier, sitting on the foot of her bed. She said she could feel his weight sitting on her bed, and that she had also felt the calm that I'd experienced. The fact that I wasn't scared when I saw him in my ill health makes me think he was watching over me, worried about my well-being.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. That's an amazing story. You've got a little bit of everything there. You've got physical apparitions, you've got noises, you've got things being moved.
Yeah, you've got a bit of poltergeist activity there, stuff being thrown around.
It's almost like what didn't happen.
Yeah, and I thought the end of that story was going to be, and I had a fever, and then to find out that her mother had seen the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
That would chill you, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure what would have spooked me most, but I do think hearing footsteps when there's nobody else there is pretty terrifying.
Yeah, that's very creepy. And I think with the apparition that appeared when she was sick, both her and her mum experienced this same comforting presence, and it really sounds more like a protective thing to me than anything sinister.
Yeah, it did feel very much like somebody was just checking in on them to make sure they're okay rather than trying to scare them.
Yeah, definitely.
And thank you again to Sarah for sending in that story. We really enjoyed it, but it's back to the Christmas quiz.
Right. Similarities. Is one of them feasting?
One of them is feasting, banqueting.
Eating in general, stuffing one's face. Okay. And how about gift giving?
Gift giving is also another one. Well done.
I win.
Well, you won already, but yes, you doubly
win. But I win with 1.5 points instead of half a point.
You do. I would have also accepted the sacrifice of a suckling pig, which was was referenced to the previous one.
Yep, roast ham, yep.
Yep, also all people being equal. There was this sort of sentiment that all people were made equal. And
on that day. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
and that slaves were served by their masters or would eat with their masters.
Very cool.
And
not cool to have servants in the first place,
not
obviously.
Good to have slaves.
No.
Obviously very bad.
No, none of that.
But yes, there was the sort of goodwill and equality and
feast to all men.
A partying and carnival atmosphere I would have also accepted.
Okay.
As well. But yes, well done. You win.
I am the winner. That's unusual.
I'm afraid that's pretty much all we've got time for this episode.
But before we go, we'd just like to thank everybody that sent in a story to us today. And if maybe you have a little bit of time to think about things that might have happened to you over the festive holiday season, please do hop on over to our website at knockonceforyes.com and consider sharing your story with us. So last thing before we bid you a Merry Christmas and farewell, the obligatory terrible Christmas cracker joke.
Oh.
And the party hats.
We were already wearing our party hats. We told them we were.
Ready? What kind of dessert does a ghost like?
I don't know. What type of dessert does a ghost like?
Ice cream.
Okay, are you ready?
Yeah.
Why did the elf push his bed into the fireplace?
I don't know. Why did the elf push his bed into the fireplace?
He wanted to sleep like a log.
Oh my god. Yep, that's truly terrible. Right, party hat on.
I'm afraid that really is it for this episode. The only thing that's left is to wish everyone a happy Christmas, a Merry New Year, a happy Saturnalia, good Kwanzaa, whatever you
Merry
celebrate.
Yule.
Yes.
Whatever you celebrate, or if you don't celebrate at all, I hope you at least get a day off work.
Yes, happy Hanukkah. Are there any more?
I think we better quit while we're ahead. We'll see you in the new year, guys.